Okay, so the next session is the final session for today's broadcast, and we're finishing on a topic of discussion that's critical in delivering a net zero business, engaging and empowering suppliers. For many, this is where a significant proportion of emissions are found. I'm pleased to say we're joined by 3 excellent speakers, and this session has been produced in partnership with Anthesis, one of our event lead partners. As you'll see on the screen, we've got Elena Kocherovsky, Principal Consultant at Anthesis, Nell, Triplett, Corporate Affairs Manager at Synopsys, and Louisa, McGuirk, Senior Manager of Sustainable Procurement at Salesforce. It's live. It's going to be going for 45 minutes, and they're here to answer some of your questions. So do use the Q&A box just to the side of the screen here, and get through as many of them as they can. But for now, it's my pleasure to hand over to Elena to get the discussion underway.
Excellent. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am going to share some slides today, so bear with me. All right, hopefully that is up and running. Let me know if it's not. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a really important and timely conversation. I think we can all agree on that, on how to empower suppliers to help deliver a net zero business. Again, my name is Elena Kocherovsky. I'm a principal consultant with Anthesis. We are a global sustainability activator, and we work with hundreds of companies and organizations around the world on sustainability analytics, solutions, and all the way through supporting implementation of sustainability programs. I am going to be your moderator for this discussion today, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Nell and by Louisa, who will get a chance to introduce themselves a bit more in just a few moments here. But before we dive into the panel discussion today, I just wanted to make sure we set some context for the discussion that we're about to have. We're all here to dive into how we can continue progress towards a net zero carbon transformation over the next decade plus. And we certainly cannot have that conversation without addressing supply chains, where for most companies, a very significant portion of their emissions really lie. So I think first, it is very important to define net zero, as I'm sure all of you are painfully aware of the multitude of often confusing and overlapping climate terminology and jargon. But to sum it up, since the Paris Climate Accord back in 2015, which really gave us the blueprint for science-based targets, and then with the review and the revision of our global climate trajectory from the IPCC in 2018, I think it's really clear from the scientific community that we must reach net zero global carbon emissions by mid-century in order to limit that global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees to minimize the destructive impacts of climate change. So how do we get there? At Anthesis, we really see 4 key levers to achieving this net zero ambition. I think the first one is probably the most obvious: avoiding emissions in the first place. This is pretty straightforward. The easiest set of carbon to manage is the one that you don't emit in the first place, of course. And this really requires looking closely into both your operations and the design of your products and services to identify ways to minimize the amount of emissions required across these processes. In reality, however, for most of us, that is an early design step, and we really fall into the bucket of needing to reduce. And this is really focusing, as it sounds, on measures to reduce emissions across existing operations, supply chains, products, and that comes through efficiency measures and starting to adopt more renewable energy, really. The next is around investment, which really relates to things like purchasing avoided emissions offsets, as well as investment into carbon removal projects to balance out a company's remaining carbon footprint. And I will differentiate between those 2 types of offsets in just a moment here. Lastly is innovation, the transformation of business models, new technologies, and definitely widespread collaboration that's required to shift towards a low carbon system. So on the path towards net zero, companies should definitely be focused on first achieving absolute emission reductions. That's shown by the orange bars here on the screen and is a first and foremost priority. And that's what science-based targets are really focused on, is that absolute emission reduction. Now, along that journey towards net zero, companies can use carbon offsets from avoided emissions projects, which are shown in the dark blue lines. And these can be used to claim carbon neutrality. However, big however, to meet and achieve net zero, the latest guidance really states that only removals offsets can be used to balance out a company's residual emissions, meaning that this is the investment in projects, natural solutions, and technologies that enable the removal or sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere. And then one last technical note, so that we're all on the same page. I should mention that in terms of scope 3 emissions, in terms of value chain, the current guidance has not yet made a final decision on whether 100% of scope 3 emissions or 2/3 threshold that's typically referenced in SBTs needs to be included in the scope of a net zero target. That is something that's going to be really resolved over the next 12 months through collaboration and alignment. So all of that to say is that we have a lot of work to do. And from our perspective, supply chains and supplier engagement are going to be really at the heart of this transformation. We know that for most companies, supply chain emissions are a huge proportion of their total carbon footprint, and that achieving scope 3 reductions is really going to require a lot of engagement collaboration within supply chain and with supply chain partners. And regardless of whether you have a supplier engagement goal or just an absolute reduction goal, it is absolutely going to require that collaboration, education, providing resources so that we can collectively start to drive down emissions within the supply chain. And I think the really important point to make here is that just simply asking your suppliers to reduce emissions or set science-based targets is not going to lead to the transformation that we're looking for. That engagement, that support, that collaboration is really how we unlock progress. Just a quick snapshot of current progress in terms of science-based targets. This is where we are. And we know science-based targets are a critical milestone towards that net zero goal that we're all chasing after. So well over 400 companies have now set their SBTs across 43 different sectors. Large majority, over 90%, include scope 3 emissions within their goals. Again, illustrating the importance of this conversation. And about 20% of those have included specific supplier engagement goals. But as we just mentioned, either way, if you have a supplier engagement goal or not, you're gonna need to do that supply chain engagement. All right. And just to quickly summarize before we dive in just a moment, this is what we're currently seeing in terms of companies who are starting down their journey with science-based targets. We're really just at the starting point. Companies are just defining which suppliers are in scope for these programs, how they're going to manage that engagement and data collection, how they're going to do that support and education, capacity building component, and what incentives will really play a role in driving the kind of accelerated action that we really need. And we're very lucky to have both Nell and Louisa that are going to share a bit more about their journey and how they're thinking about this. But I just want to really ground the conversation in the fact that we're all just getting started. We're collectively all just getting started, and we're all figuring this out together. And I think forums like this are really important for us to share information, share what we're learning as we pave this road forward. So enough with me. Let's start and dive into the conversation. I am very pleased to be joined by Nell Triplett and Louisa McGuirk. I'm going to first ask them each to go ahead and introduce themselves, your company, your role, and also briefly summarize for us where your company currently is in this whole science-based target net zero journey. So maybe Louisa, we can start with you and then shift over to Nell.
Sure. Good morning or afternoon, wherever folks are. I'm Louisa McGuirk. I'm the Senior Manager of Sustainable Procurement at Salesforce. I sit on our global procurement and sourcing team, where I manage our supply chain sustainability programs. And Salesforce finalized our science-based target in November of last year with approval from the Science Based Targets Initiative. And that target does include a commitment that 60% of our suppliers by emissions will set their own SBTs by 2024. So I actually joined Salesforce just this April, and a large part of my role is focused on meeting that supplier engagement target. I guess as far as where we are in this journey. We've of course got that target set, and then we've been working over the last year to really set a foundation for this program, set our strategy, and start driving engagement. So we started with our economic input-output analysis, really trying to understand our supplier base and where our emissions have, like where the biggest impact is, and then also some desktop research so that we could segment our suppliers for that engagement. We have also outlined our broad vision and strategy, kicked off some engagements with our highest priority suppliers, and now we're really starting to look at sort of the next layer. How do we engage with that broader supplier base on target setting, understanding their capabilities, their interests, and that's where we're going. So as we head into this conversation, I'll just say that it's still a new program for us. We definitely don't have it all figured out yet, but we're really excited to share what we've learned and just keep learning for ourselves by staying engaged in this conversation. And so really grateful for the opportunity to be here.
Excellent. Nell?
Hi, everyone. I'm Nell Triplett. I'm Corporate Affairs Manager at Synopsys. So that means I'm driving our CSR initiatives around emissions reduction and carbon neutrality. Just for context for everything that I'm going to be talking about in a little bit. So Synopsys is a software company, global software company headquartered in the San Francisco Bay Area. What we do, we make tools for the semiconductor industry to develop smarter, faster, bug-free, and more efficient chips. So on this panel, you can think of me as your supplier voice, and I would characterize Synopsys as early in our emissions inventory journey. So maybe we are the teenager here. We are mature, full of ambition, and so we've developed a science-based target that was just we went out with in June. But we also have a bit more work to do. We have our work cut out in fully quantifying our Scope 3 emissions. That is our next real focus for 2021. And we just didn't want that to prevent us from advancing our Scope 1 and 2 emissions target. So I'm also very happy to be on this panel and to provide a little bit more perspective on those of you who may be also early in the journey.
Thanks so much, Nell. And we'll stay with you. You mentioned kind of high level where you're at, but could you share a little bit more about what that science-based target journey looked like for you? How long did it take? What were the primary drivers for setting the goal? And what role did perhaps your customers play in setting that goal in the context of all of this?
Sure. So part of the commitment really was derived from our decision to go carbon neutral in 2019 and then again 2020. So obviously emissions offsetting goes hand in hand with emissions reduction. That was part of the impetus for us to get a science-based target in place. You mentioned the customer role, certainly pressure from customers, and in particular, one very important customer helped build the internal case. And maybe I can just, Elena, if you could pull up my slide, since I'm more of a visual person, maybe I can just walk through our process and how we got to our target. Yeah, so here's an overview of our approach. Everyone does it differently, but this was our approach to an SBT development. The first thing, obviously, goes without saying, climate change is the most urgent global problem. Our stakeholders very clearly were reflecting a desire for us to get target in place. So this is including customers, institutional investors, employees. So understanding the impetus is key. Next, as far as benchmarking peers, we benchmarked 14 of them, some of whom had no target, some of whom had a target, others, a few had SBT. Reviewing best practices, obviously, science-based targets have to be in line with the warming scenarios in order to keep global warming in check. Modeling our emissions and reduction scenarios. So we needed to ensure that however we were going to model this, we could actually deliver. And we were able to model out our forecast in order to our emissions forecast, our operational emissions forecast, and identify specific measures through energy efficiency and transition to clean power that would enable us to deliver on the target. And so then that led us to our goal proposal. Here's where we landed: 25% reduction in our GHG emissions by 2024. That's based on our 2018 baseline, which was our first year for collecting that data. And this was a very fast process, essentially some months to reach consensus on the target. And then in June, that's when we announced it.
Excellent. All right, let's go back here. Thank you so much, Nell. So Louisa, turning to you, Salesforce decided to go the route of setting a supplier engagement goal as a component of your scope 3 goals. Is that right? So if that's the case, could you speak a little bit to the rationale and the pros and cons of including that within your science-based target?
Yeah, and I'll focus on a few highlights. I think there's a lot here, but the first thing to note is that the supplier target, the engagement target, makes sense for a company like Salesforce, where the majority of our scope 3 emissions are in purchased goods and services. That impact is spread across a variety of purchasing categories. Our preferred target might look a little different if our emissions were heavily downstream, for example. But given that, this made a lot of sense for us. And I think one of the biggest benefits for sure is that the supplier engagement target has an impact that extends beyond our own footprint. So when a supplier sets a science-based target, it covers their full operations, not just the emissions that are attributable to their business with Salesforce. It's also very likely that their science-based target will cover their supply chain. And so then you also have this ripple effect when you're setting that kind of target. So this means that the impact of influencing or enabling a supplier to set a science-based target is many times bigger than if we only focused on reducing our own scope 3 emissions, the scope 3 emissions attributed to our business. So we love that about it. Another benefit, especially since I sit within procurement, I see that this kind of target is relatively easy to understand, and it provides a really consistent goal that the whole procurement team can unite behind and work towards together. So I can engage all of our sourcing managers in every category with pretty much the same task and message. We need X number of suppliers to set this kind of target, and here's how we're going to do that. So at a high level, we can really implement the same process integration and supplier engagement strategies across the procurement org, even if we may tweak that approach for specific suppliers or categories. So it's just kind of fun to have that like rallying goal that really the whole org can get behind and speak to together. So third benefit then is that, as has been mentioned, to address climate change, we of course need immediate action. And I do feel like the engagement target really let us get to work faster and right away on achieving the target. We had access to data on who our suppliers are. We could reasonably estimate their relative impact with that economic input-output analysis. And so that gave us the confidence we needed, enough confidence to move forward and start taking action without needing to spend a lot of time collecting primary data, refining measurements and methodologies. And I do think those things can sometimes plague making progress on scope 3, where you just get bogged down in this question of data. So we do still intend to quantify our absolute impact, and we do have absolute emissions targets that complement this goal. But in the meantime, it just feels like we've been able to get started on action and to jump in than we might have otherwise. And actually, I guess what I'll add on the sort of con side is that it's not that there are no data challenges, of course, with an engagement target. One that's really important to think about is, and this may be kind of obvious, but your supplier base will change. So you'll add new suppliers, you'll switch suppliers, the weight of your business will shift between purchasing categories. COVID has provided a very extreme example of how this can happen, where we see that business just shifting so much. So you do, you can end up with kind of a moving target. And so that's something we're still figuring out. How do we best show year over year progress in a way that's tied to our absolute emissions, and have that data piece? But it's, in the meantime, it's not holding us back from getting started on engagement and taking action.
That's so critical, because the level of ambition of these goals and the timelines that we have to achieve them, there's no time to wait, essentially. We have to get started now. So I think that's a really key message that is important for everybody to digest, to dive right in. You mentioned working with procurement teams and that you actually sit within procurement. So I'm curious if you can add on in terms of who within Salesforce is really involved in managing and driving these goals forward. Is it a sustainability thing? Is it a procurement thing?
Yeah, those are the two that you just mentioned. Those are the two primary teams involved, sustainability team and our global procurement and sourcing, or GPS team. And we're working really collaboratively on this. So the sustainability team, they guide our overall climate strategy for Salesforce. They led the target setting process. So they really kicked this off. They helped shape that foundation. And then now when it comes to working with our suppliers to set and achieve those targets, or their targets, the strategy and execution are really driven by procurement and sourcing, the team that I sit on. And sustainability is still very closely involved in the strategy design. We sync regularly. We have great support from them. I also get to bring my sustainability perspective into some of their other strategizing on other types of climate programs. So that's really great. We have that collaboration, and then the day-to-day execution of those engagements really falls within procurement.
Excellent. Nell, what about you? How, in terms of science-based targets and your climate programs, how's that typically managed within Synopsys?
So we don't have a standalone sustainability lead, which has its own set of challenges. But I report out through our general counsel, and in this case, we had commitment at the highest level of the company for our carbon neutrality initiative and for all of our other climate action work. So based on that, our general counsel was able to really steer the ship and build consensus around an SBT. He convened what we call our emissions reduction task force, comprised of key leaders around the company, including head of facilities, our CIO, and a director in finance. Together, they were able to reach a consensus on development of our SBT. And throughout this process, we were expertly advised by Anthesis, which was absolutely key, because we don't have a standalone sustainability lead within the company. We really needed somebody who helps companies develop their SBTs. This is what they do day in, day out. They provided the framework, they made the whole process flow, and really it helped build credibility for what we were trying to achieve. So that was absolutely essential in the process, and especially given how quickly we were moving, as I mentioned. One really positive thing I would just note about the Emissions Reduction Task Force, so we announced our target in June. Since then, they have been hard at work. In particular, one of the task force's members has brought to our attention a virtual power purchase agreement, VPPA, opportunity that we are thick in middle of evaluating right now. And I don't want to go into the specifics of the VPPA for the purposes of this panel, but it would obviously help us decarbonize and help us deliver on our target by 2024. So that's really exciting. We wasted no time in pursuing action.
Amazing. It's important to also mention the strategies on how we're going to get there. So that's a really good call out. Louisa, could you talk to us a little bit about how Salesforce approached designing and deploying your supplier engagement program on SBTs? Earlier, I said, you can't just put an ask out there and hope that everybody gets on board and starts driving down emissions. So talk to us a little bit about how you're thinking about your program and your goals.
Yeah, that's so true. And since we are just getting started, I'll share sort of at a high level some of the things that are driving our approach. One is absolutely that piece that our biggest focus is supplier enablement. we want to create a program that provides tools and resources that help our suppliers set and achieve their SBTs, and where Salesforce is deeply invested in their success. We are so fortunate at Salesforce, and I feel like I just have to acknowledge that we have top-down support, we have resources. So I really see it as our responsibility and privilege to help bring others along through collaboration, transparency, resource sharing, still to be determined exactly what that looks like. But we won't achieve this goal unless we play a really active role in helping our suppliers, enabling them, building capacity. So that's really critical. And sort of this guiding light for us. And then the other thing, and Nell referenced this earlier, is that we also know that our voice as a customer is just an incredibly powerful tool. So we think it's critical that sustainability and target setting, that those become part of our business relationship with our suppliers, and that we clearly communicate our commitment and our expectations. So we've prioritized at the outset really engaging and educating our internal teams, our category managers, our sourcing directors, the people who are day-to-day driving those relationships. They know the suppliers, they know what negotiations are coming up or what strategic business reviews are happening, and they're leading those conversations. So we want to make sure that they're on board, they are able to speak to these commitments and to share them with their suppliers. And then when we're communicating with our suppliers, we want both the messenger and the audience to include business-facing teams. So it's not just like a side conversation between two sustainability professionals. We're engaging our team, and then also maybe like their account manager or someone who's more of their focus is satisfying customers. We want them to know what these expectations are. And then the sort of third big piece that guides our initial program foundation is that we don't want to build our programs in a vacuum. We know there are other companies out there, other organizations out there doing the same kind of work. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel. And we also don't want to create an ecosystem in which suppliers are facing really different demands from each of their customers. So we are talking a lot with our peers. We're looking around to see what frameworks are out there and to really understand what gaps Salesforce can uniquely fill. So as an example, last year we released a really great carbon accounting product called Sustainability Cloud. And we have an opportunity there to think about how could that fit into our supplier engagement toolbox. And that's just one example, but we do want to think about sort of that unique value proposition of how does Salesforce contribute uniquely to this challenge, and what can we bring to the table. So those are, sort of at that high level, some of the things we've been thinking about.
Excellent, some good stuff in there. We got a question from the audience that I think is relevant in all of this because it is a unique year. And so the question is around, the whole value chain's impacted substantially due to the pandemic, and that is hitting supplier budgets and whatnot and capacity. So how has this year been for you in terms of, are you adjusting? Are you slowing down? Any shifts that you're making in consideration of that?
I think one big thing here is that we're absolutely looking at that. We're thinking about it, and that's one of those places where our category managers are so valuable because they have that day-to-day relationship. They know the struggles. So before I do any kind of engagement with a supplier, I'm reaching out to them first to say, is this a good time? What's the right approach? And there are absolutely suppliers where the answer is, no, this is a terrible time. This would not be a good time to reach out. And so respecting that and taking that into account when we're thinking about how to approach suppliers in a way that feels supportive and recognizes their unique situations. As far as like resources and support, we're still defining what that looks like. And I think that could take a lot of different forms, but as I was just saying, like absolutely that enablement, that support is really key. And we'll continue to take this approach of looking at each supplier, one-on-one and understanding what is their situation and how can they be best supported at this time.
Excellent. Just piggybacking a little bit on some of these themes we've been talking about. Obviously, there's probably, I'm guessing, hundreds of suppliers that are in scope for your goals. Are there ways that you're prioritizing your engagement? Are you reaching out to all of them all at once? How are you kind of designing that piece of it?
Yeah, prioritization, definitely essential when you've got hundreds or thousands of companies that are your suppliers. So I've mentioned that we did this economic input-output assessment, great support from Anthesis, and that was critical to starting that prioritization, understanding who our biggest suppliers from an impact perspective are. We also supported that with some desktop research, looking at CDP reports, sustainability reports, major climate commitments like Step Up or RE100 to figure out which suppliers either already had targets or maybe were making progress on them or might be sort of low-hanging fruit. And we did jump in with some initial one-on-one conversations with some of those suppliers that we felt were really like high capacity and high willingness or high interest. And so had those one-on-one conversations to share our commitment, learn more about their challenges, their intentions, in some cases thinking about how that could fit in with our actual business relationship with that supplier. But of course, desktop research and one-on-one engagements isn't very scalable. So we did just launch our next layer of engagement, which was to send out a survey to a large group of suppliers, asking them similar questions about their progress and interests and challenges. And we're going to use that to really design the next phase of our enablement and engagement programs, but letting that help to do some of that prioritization of who do we want to engage with and when and how, and realizing there will be different segments that we use a different approach with. I will say that letter it was accompanied by a cover letter, or the survey was accompanied by a cover letter co-signed by our Chief Procurement Officer and VP, Vice President of Sustainability. So just to reference back to that point of we see our voice as being really important and wanting to make this part of the business relationship. So that letter especially coming from the Chief Procurement Officer and outlining those commitments was an important piece. And I guess a final thought would just be that we can also segment by category. So there are certain areas like real estate and workplaces where we've historically really prioritized some of our sustainability efforts, and we're used to engaging with suppliers in those areas. So we can start at a slightly different place with the science-based target setting than we might a supplier that we had never engaged with on sustainability before. And then they also provide a great testing ground for rolling out some pilot program elements before we launch them broadly, just to be able to work in those categories that have some history with us on sustainability.
Excellent. All really important pieces for folks to take into consideration as they're starting to go down this road. Excellent. Now, turning to you, could you talk to us a little bit about, so Louisa spoke a lot about how they're thinking about designing their engagement program and thinking through tools and resources and all that good stuff. What type of engagement or perhaps even incentives might you want to see from your customers that would help accelerate your company's action on climate? Or maybe there's already a few examples that you've seen.
Yeah, well, carrots are always good. I mean, sticks work, but I think things like preferential supplier status or awards, those are really visible things that I think send a strong signal for demand for companies committed to sustainability. And, it also just helps us build the case internally for embedding sustainability throughout our company's operations or all aspects of the business. We have benefited from supplier, especially, preferential status. So that's one carrot that I think is really, really terrific. And as I said, it sends a very strong signal within the company that this is an area to prioritize. I would just say, as sort of a general reflection, it takes so much hard work to roll out something like an SBT. Your meetings are not the easy ones. It's so hard sometimes to get everybody on board to something so time-bound and specific. And so, like an emissions target, but once it is set, once it's made public and there's excitement, it's amazing how everybody gets on board and wants to tout the commitment. And I bring this up just because it becomes such a positive and enabling story for supplier recognition. And that's absolutely something to think about as we discuss supply chain engagement.
That's fantastic. I think many companies are still, again, figuring this all out. We're at the early stages, but for those that are listening on the line, I think incentives and that recognition goes a really long way. So I think the next, in the next year, as we really make progress on this, that will be a critical key to kind of unlock and really accelerating that change we're looking for. Sticking with you, Nell, what about data and reporting? Are you being asked to report your climate progress through any tools? We actually got a question from the audience around what metrics are being used or tools being used to track progress, whether it's CDP reporting or something else. What is Synopsys doing in that space?
Yeah, so we have requests every year from our customers to disclose our CCQ via the CDP. And that's a platform that we would like to more fully leverage for our own Scope 3 inventorying as we build that out. One thing that's interesting is CDP disclosure has increased from 2018 to 2019 by 20%, which to me says two things. One is that there's obviously an uptick in demand by companies, investors, other stakeholders for climate action and disclosure. That's one thing. And then the second thing is really obviously that CDP is becoming the standard for disclosure. And I think this is really important. I think standardization of data is really important because we're talking about so much that's going into quantification of Scope 1, 2, and 3. I think that for us with quantifying our own Scopes 1 and 2, it was really a challenging process. I mean, honestly, it was very, very hard. We did, especially on the facility side, we didn't have a global system for reporting energy consumption. So it was kind of an ad hoc, the first year it was an ad hoc process to get that data. It's one of those things that you refine, you learn from the first year, and then especially if you're able to record lessons learned, you can do it a bit better the following year.
Excellent. Any challenges you found with those sorts of reporting frameworks? On the, obviously standardization is a great thing, but on the challenges side, anything you run into?
Well, it's a huge lift for a very lean team. It is a huge lift to disclose on an annual basis to the CDP. So a lot of the questions are obviously not just around your data, but more qualitative questions. And that takes some explaining, doing some internal education around what CDP is looking for. That can be a challenge, especially, this is maybe something that we live and breathe, but within the company, it's a different lingo.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I'm glad that question came through because we're a little bit at risk because we're all starting to move so quickly into this. There's this risk of everybody trying to track and measure these things in slightly different ways throughout the supply chain, and especially for suppliers that might have multiple customers that are setting these goals and trying to track progress. I think it's important for all of us collectively to be mindful that we try to streamline and not kind of increase burden or reduce that redundancy for all of this tracking and measuring that we are undoubtedly all gonna start embarking on. Wonderful, thank you for sharing that. So starting to tread towards the end of the conversation, and if there's any final questions, do feel free to chat them in. But Louisa, maybe we'll shift to you. What advice can you share with other companies who are just getting started on their journeys, evaluating these types of goals and programs?
Yeah, I guess looking sort of at both sides, if you're on the starting to create these supplier engagement programs, I think absolutely get to know your supply chain team and your customer account teams. That's just sort of for either side. For those engagement targets, get to know your supply chain team. If you're trying to get buy-in for a target, get to know your customer account teams. Figure out who are your biggest customers and what are they asking your company for, and is that a lever you can pull to get approval for this kind of target. And then on that, get to know your supply chain team side. My experience has just been that there's so much interest there, and employees really, they want to contribute to sustainability, but they don't always have that lingo. They don't know exactly how what it all means or how they can contribute. So taking time to introduce sustainability as a concept and how it fits into your company, what role those teams could play, as well as figuring out what are their systems for organizing, what are their priorities. I just can't emphasize enough that they have those day-to-day relationships with the suppliers and can really be your foot in the door. They can keep you from walking into a situation where you're maybe not set up for success the way you could be if you had the background that they're able to share about that supplier relationship. So I think those things are really important. And then also, can't stress enough the economic input out analysis or some sort of hot spotting. It's just so critical to have that first pass of data to really know to where to focus your efforts, which part of your scope 3, which part of your supply chain, which part of your supplier base is just really instrumental.
Excellent. Very true. Nell, what about you? Any advice you want to share, especially from a supplier perspective on, where maybe there's others that are hearing this request coming from their customers, or they themselves are trying to drive forward these goals? What would you suggest, or what advice you would impart on them?
My takeaway message would be, you can be early in your climate efforts, but you can still be bold and you can still be ambitious. I think if I were to whittle it down to just 3 pieces of advice, first, identify your internal champions. And this is for those of you who are early in this journey, but where you want to go. It's those internal champions who are going to get you there. The second thing I would just say is make bold recommendations, because this is an area we all know this is urgent. You have to make sure you can deliver on any bold recommendation, but I think you're not going to be penalized for really making a bold recommendation. In fact, if anything, with this particular area, it lends credibility. And the third piece of advice I would provide is just use others to make the case for you. It's our customers, institutional investors, employees. They're the ones who really will be listened to, and especially if I can methodically record their requests and demands and present it internally in a compelling way. I think we got a question earlier on about these times, and I think we should just address that at the conclusion here. I mean, we're living in really strange times, and the challenge of today's times can also be seen as an opportunity. Who would have thought back in March, that our world would be turned upside down by, a pathogen that has traversed the world? Who would have thought? And yet it is in these times that it forces you to do things differently. It's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge for me every single day, but that's how you start to think and do things in a dramatically different way. So I think, 2020 has also really exposed, just speaking to the area of supply chain vulnerabilities, 2020 has definitely exposed those. Disruption can prompt, fundamentally different approaches to business and business processes. That's a really important thing to this conversation. This is all to say my work, your work, all of our work, well, it's cut out for us, but I think we're moving toward the same endpoint, and through upstream, downstream engagement, I think it's a real moment of opportunity for supply chain collaboration.
Brilliant. I don't even want to say anything after that. That was perfect. Well, thank you both, Nell and Louisa, so much for joining us today. I hope everyone on the line found this a useful conversation. We do have a lot of work to do, but it is through collaboration and tackling these challenges together and one step at a time that we're absolutely going to get there towards that net zero future we're looking for. Thanks so much for joining us, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Oh, Liam, you're on mute.
There we are. There we are. Thank you. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Nell. And thank you, Louisa, for an excellent discussion. Take care, guys.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yes, on that note, on the note of collaboration and working together to achieve the net zero future we want to see, that's, I think, the sentiment. It's a great sentiment to end the event on. And unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this year's Transform USA 2020 event. The Reuters events team and I would like to thank all of the speakers, sponsors and partners for helping make this event happen. Your support throughout has been very much appreciated. And thank you to our listeners for joining us today and yesterday and submitting all the questions. We do hope we provide you with some useful ideas to help you in the coming days, weeks and months. Once again, our on-demand hub is open until the 16th of October, so do dive in. There's a number of sessions there ready and waiting already for you to access, and all of today's broadcast will be uploaded shortly. And those that have access to our networking platform, do use your logins, do dive in, do try and make some of those meetings and connections that we all need to increase that collaboration that Elena just said on the closing remarks. And that networking suite is open all of next week, so plenty of time for you to get your meetings in. In the coming weeks, we will start working on some webinars and workshops in line with today's discussion, among other topics, and they'll be taking place in November and December. If you are interested in partnering on any of our webinars or workshops, then do contact my colleague, Ed Long. They'll provide a great opportunity for you to engage our global community on the key topics impacting the sustainability profession as we go into 2021. Okay, that's it from me. It's been my pleasure to host the two-day event. I hope you found it useful and enjoyable. And with that, I wish you all the very best for today, the weekend, and the days ahead. Take care.